So earlier this morning, I promised to reveal to you the reasons of the German Historians Association's board for nominating Jürgen Kocka for the Holberg Prize. Although I hardly feel this is necessary, because many of you know about Jürgen Kocka's achievements very well. I think a promise is a promise, so I will give you at least some ideas. As early as in Jürgen Kocka's student days, I think it became apparent that this was an extraordinary, quick and original thinker interested in a wide range of issues and intellectually agile. He studied history, political science, German, sociology and philosophy at Marburg, Vienna, Berlin and at Chapel Hill, where he received his MA in political science, but his greatest passion was history, and thus it comes as no surprise that he received his PhD in 1968 for a groundbreaking historical study of capitalism and bureaucracy during industrialization in Germany. His PhD supervisor, Gerhard A. Ritter, still speaks in the highest tones of his most talented student, claiming that nearly all of Kocka's term papers were of a quality expected of a doctoral thesis. Considering these outstanding academic qualities, it may come of less of a surprise that he had already completed his Habilitation. This is again a German peculiarity, you know about that. At the age of 31, the Habilitation was about employees between fascism and democracy, the US in international comparative perspective, 1890 to 1940. And I say that again, he finished this book at the age of 31 and received the offer of a professorship in Bielefeld shortly afterwards. And this was undoubtedly a momentous decision for German historiography. Here in this modern and reform-oriented environment, and by the way, at least from my perspective, in a city that didn't have so much more to offer than a catching scholarly curiosity, academic excellence, and perhaps the Teutoburger Wald, Kocka unfolded his full potential. Here he was to become, if not the leading figure in the creation of the new and almost revolutionary approach that we all have come to know as the Bielefeld School of Social History, die Bielefelder Schule. Borrowing from methodologies of the social sciences and focusing on socioeconomic factors, long-term trends and class conflict, Kocka and his academic peers affected a real paradigm shift in German historiography. They defined history as enlightenment and consequently assumed a political position. I just listened to an interview on the 25 years of the Historikerstreit. I'm sure you all know about that. He also wrote new seminal textbooks for schools. You allow me this excursion. But of course, the most important mouthpiece of the Bielefelder Schule became the journal Geschichte and Gesellschaft, which Kocka co-founded in 1975. There is no sufficient time to name Jürgen Kocka's numerous publications. This is a very long list, and many of these publications were highly influential. What is characteristic of all these writings and his scholarly profile on the whole is that he never became mired in dogmatic trenches as some of his colleagues did. On the contrary, he has always been open to new approaches and ideas. While he does understand and respect disciplinary boundaries, he has also worked to transcend them and has often been the first to spark a dialogue between different disciplines. From this point of view, it might seem only logical, at least in hindsight, that Kocka, who left Bielefeld 1 year before the wall came down to accept a professorship at the Free University in Berlin, was appointed to the presidency of the Social Science Research Center, the WZB, in Berlin in 2001. But at the time, it certainly was a sensation of sorts that a historian, and no doubt in the role social scientist, was chosen for the renowned post. Yet if ever a historian came close to the social sciences, it was Jürgen Kocka, with his aforementioned ability to overcome established boundaries by daring to rethink issues from different angles. And it certainly did not hurt that he was not only a brilliant academic, but also an excellent manager, and this is a rare combination indeed. He had proved his talent to organize science as director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research, the ZIF in Bielefeld, proved it again as director of the Berlin School for Comparative European History, I just mentioned this morning, and needless to say, the WZB Berlin certainly blossomed with him as director. And this was not only the case for the WZB. He also left a very lasting mark as president of the International Committee of Historical Sciences, which he headed from 2000 to 2005. When I attended the International Congress of Historical Sciences in Amsterdam last year, it really came home to me to what an extent Jürgen Kocka has influenced the international community of historians and how very highly colleagues from all over the world esteem today's laureate. Kocka also was a founding member of the Academy of Europe, vice president, and still is, vice president of the Brandenburg Academy of Sciences. He is a senior fellow at the Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam, which, by the way, he co-founded in 1992, and a senior fellow at the International Research Center, Work in Human Life Cycle and Global History at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And nearly needless to say that he received a number of honorary doctorates, all honors that confirm his stature within the academic world. But we did not only nominate Jürgen Kocka for the Holberg Prize because of his extraordinary impact on academics the world over. Another reason was that he, and here you can compare him to Habermas, belongs to a species that is very rare in Germany, which is that of a public intellectual. Jürgen Kocka has the uncommon gift to depict highly complex phenomena in a way that enables laymen to grasp them. Kocka knows how to ask questions, he knows how to structure complex phenomena, he knows how to give explanations, and he knows how to get to the point, and he comes to the point. Thus his voice is heard and listened to in Germany in discussions that touch on such matters as labor and the welfare state, on the history and the future of capitalism, and of course, civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, when I stayed at St. Anthony's College in Oxford last year, many students and also colleagues told me that they were very keen to see Kocka, for some of them the first time, live and in the flesh. You now have the chance to experience him, and I'm sure that you will understand why the Oxfordians were so enthusiastic after they had heard him lecture, by the way, on the history of capitalism, and why we in Germany consider him to be one of the most influential historians working today. So it's my great pleasure and my honor to hand over the floor to Jürgen Kocka. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, many thanks to Simone Lessig for this very friendly introduction. Ich bin selbstkritisch genug, um nicht alles zu glauben, aber eitel genug, um mich darüber zu freuen. Many thanks, of course, to those who decided to award the Holberg Prize to me. I will have an opportunity tomorrow to express my gratitude. I'm grateful to those who organized this symposium, the University of Bergen, which I'm not visiting for the first time. I've been here at the history department 4 years ago. To Simone Lessig and Stein Kuhnle for organizing this symposium. To the distinguished colleagues who have accepted to come and to speak today. For all the colleagues and friends I see in the audience for having come here. 45 minutes at most. The general topic has been exposed. I want to do 3 steps. I will give a short overview about the development of the German welfare state in order to stress, on the one hand, how different the political meaning of welfare states can be. And secondly, that welfare state always presupposes quite a number of factors it does not create and does not control. Secondly, I will report some findings about the history of civil society in Germany. And thirdly, I will discuss along the lines intonated by Christoph Conrad, the relationship between welfare state and civil society in Germany and beyond. First, the German concept is Sozialstaat, which became common only after 1945, by the way. I use Sozialstaat and welfare state synonymously, which is my decision today, and in a broad sense, meaning all kind of government, including local government, policies aiming at the protection against specific risks of life, protection against unacceptable domination and exploitation in the world of labor, fight against poverty, and, more debatable, reduction of inequality. The measures reach from insurance systems and labor laws to all kinds of social services and elements of family and education policies as well. A broad, always changing spectrum of measures aiming at the welfare of individuals and families, as well as at societal integration, and I would stress at the correction of imbalances generated by the market. There were many forerunners, of course, but there is much consensus in the literature that the birth of the German welfare state occurred in the 1880s. Based on 3 state-controlled and compulsory insurances which were instituted in order to protect industrial workers, not the general poor, not the poor in general, against specific risks following from accidents at the workplace, illness, disability, and old age. Historians have labeled these insurances, quote, the most important institutional invention of the welfare state. They were innovative in a way, in that they had a national scope, were obligatory, and provided for legal claims for the right to public assistance in defined cases of neediness. With this type of Sozialstaat, Germany was a pioneer, serving as a model for other countries. It was the declared goal of Chancellor Bismarck, his government and his aides, to use staatliche Fürsorge, government care, zur Heilung sozialer Schäden, for healing social damages, and for solving social problems in order to win the minds and the souls of the people, particularly the minds and the souls of those from the partly hostile and organizing working class, to win them for the young and still very unconsolidated nation state just founded one decade before. And it was a contribution to nation building. It was a contribution to the nationalization of the masses, an attempt to win legitimacy for the new state, the government, and the governing elites. And I should add, not without success. In Germany, more than anywhere else, the formation of the nation state and the emergence of the welfare state coincided and were interlinked. This intended coincidence, partly to a large extent, explains why the Sozialstaat came so early in Germany. It explains why it crystallized around the state-based insurance systems. And it also explains why the Sozialstaat has been such an important element in the public collective consciousness of Germans until today. It's important to see that it was a relatively conservative, autocratic, although modernizing, government within a pre-democratic, relatively authoritarian state, which pioneered this type of welfare state, and left liberals and social democrats rejected the first series of relevant laws. The left liberals feared that the increasing strength of the state, and the social democrats, not without justification, perceived the new welfare state as a weapon directed against them. So it was not a social movement which led to this welfare state. There was a social movement, but the welfare state, in a way, was a way to control it. It was, among other things, it was very indicative that Imperial Germany, while pioneering the state-based insurance system, stayed backward compared with Western and Northern Europe with respect to other aspects of the welfare state, labor law, for instance, until World War I. Now, during the Weimar years, the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1932, the German welfare state expanded and diversified, and its political meaning deeply changed. Social citizenship was now incorporated in the new democratic constitution. Benefits were raised. Labor laws were generously instituted. Collective bargaining rights and workers' co-determination were strengthened, and the spectrum of welfare services was broadened, including family allowances, housing subsidies, and national obligatory unemployment insurance in 1927. In these years, between 1919 and 1932, the fate of the welfare state was closely connected to the fate of the young republic. Supported now by moderate social democrats and left liberals and the Catholic Center Party, welfare reforms in the early Weimar years were meant to take out the steam from radical protesters and from the pro-revolutionary left wing of the labor movement. But the more costly the welfare reforms became, and the more the government directly intervened into the labor conflicts, the more controversial the government became. Now, it was the conservative right which resented the further expansion, the further extension of welfarism. And frequently, the rejection of the welfare state turned into the rejection of the Weimar Republic altogether. So the attempt of stabilizing the Weimar Republic as a welfare state failed. It failed due to the intensity of class conflicts and due to the economic depression after 1929, which eliminated or eroded benefits and services of the welfare state. Looking back, one understands that whereas the Sozialstaat indeed can contribute to social pacification, it also presupposes, in order to function, a minimum of societal consensus, or rather the ability to produce it. It also presupposes economic growth, and both consensus and growth were scarce in Weimar Germany. The Nazis did not fundamentally change the established pattern, but they destroyed the democratic components of the Sozialstaat, union rights, for instance. They instituted compulsive labor conflict settlement procedures. They continued what had already started before World War I and continued in the 1920s, namely the incorporation of additional social groups into the insurance schemes beyond the workers who had been the first addressees. For instance, self-employed craftsmen in 1938. Poor relief was improved. And most important, the Nazis used the instruments of the welfare state, especially in the field of public health policies, for racist and eugenic purposes, for the discrimination, exclusion, and destruction of minorities. No doubt, Nazi welfare policies decisively contributed to the broad acceptance of the regime in large parts of the population. Looking back, it's irritating, but important to remember, to see that the arrangements of the welfare state, if not buttressed by constitutional safeguards and due process of law, can quickly be used and misused for the very illiberal control of the population and even for inhumane purposes. In other words, the framework is decisive. The conditions count by which the welfare state is influenced without creating them. Now, during the first 25 years of the Federal Republic of Germany, 1949 to mid-1970s, the Sozialstaat underwent an enormous expansion, made possible by exceptional rates of economic growth. You have to understand, ideas of national power had been deeply shattered during dictatorship, war, and defeat. Sovereignty had been lost. The West German state could not possibly present itself as a proud national state. So the Federal Republic of Germany drew much of its official self-understanding and of its legitimacy from becoming a successful welfare state, promising security, enjoying acceptance, and supporting the second and now successful attempt of Germans to build up a democracy. In the early years, the huge task of incorporating returning soldiers, refugees, expellees was shouldered and solved. In 1957, the old age pensions were dramatically raised and for the years to come linked to the upward movement of real wages. Step by step, the spectrum of welfare services and of social groups benefiting from them was broadened. The general welfare reform of the early 1970s made the portion of the GDP used for welfare state benefits and transfers jump on unprecedented levels from 20 to 25%, where it had been in the 1960s, to 33% in 1975. Most of these decisions expanding the welfare state were supported by both major parties, the CDU and the SPD, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, who sometimes outcompeted each other with popular but costly programs. So the social basis, the political basis of the welfare state extremely changed between the Wilhelmine Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the Federal Republic of Germany. The Bismarckian pattern, however, was extended but basically maintained. Social scientists like Esping Andersen have characterized the German welfare state as a conservative one, as a welfare state which stressed security over equality, which treated different status groups differently, and even cemented certain types of social inequality, including gender inequality. And there is also continuing differences of living standard acquired during one's occupational labor life for the period in retirement. In this respect, the German pattern differed and differs from more liberal varieties in the West and more egalitarian varieties in the north of Europe. But the mid-1970s marked a turning point, after which the fast expansion of the West German welfare state, so typical and decisive for the founding period of the Federal Republic, could not be continued due to major challenges, several challenges. On the one hand, as we all know, economic growth slowed down since the mid-1970s in Germany, like in other parts of the Western world, paralleled by a tectonic shift, I would say, of economic and social policy preferences towards the right, towards more market and less state, towards deregulation and neoliberalism until recently. Under these conditions, the demand for consolidating welfare state costs, for decelerating its growth and even reducing costs became extremely powerful. And this demand became urgent in the light of ever-rising levels of public indebtedness until today. On the other hand, second challenge, a fundamental restructuring of work and family relations is taking place, accelerated by the digital revolution. The pattern of the German welfare state had been strictly oriented towards the male breadwinner family model. That is, fundamental gender inequalities and the idea of a lifelong income of the husband and father, steady and sufficient to support the family. Now, reality has never been fully consistent with this model. But as a consequence of the more recent changes, the model has become anachronistic. As a consequence, the welfare state needs heavy restructuring. And there is, of course, thirdly, everybody knows it, the demographic change, very pronounced in Germany. Its consequences for the welfare state have been discussed, by the way, by experts since the late 1970s. But in recent years, the public has become aware of this fundamental and unprecedented change. In the German case, there is a fourth major challenge: unification. The tremendous financial costs of unification meant an additional burden for the West German welfare state, which was quickly extended without much modification to the eastern part, to the former GDR, after 1990. And if you understand how closely related the history of the welfare state and the history of the national state has always been in Germany, it is logical to have done this so quickly. So, given the pressures of national unification, welfare state reforms, which had started in the 80s, were now delayed and started much later to become effective. It's, by the way, questionable whether one should speak of a Sozialstaat in the GDR. Certainly, the GDR's East Germany. The GDR spent a lot for the social protection of its citizens, had an elaborate system of risk prevention and care, subsidized consumption, reduced inequality. For all that, the GDR spent much more than it could afford on the basis of its not very efficient economy. One reason why it collapsed. But if it is the essence of a Sozialstaat to compensate for, with political means for inequalities, risks, and damages produced by the capitalist market economy, the GDR did not have a Sozialstaat because it did not have a capitalist market economy. But on that, there is no consensus in the literature. And if you accept that there was a Sozialstaat in the GDR, it was a Sozialstaat which was very illiberal, which was part of a dictatorship, and which failed. Now, in the Federal Republic of Germany, unified in the extended FRG, since the 1990s, major changes have taken place due to the challenges which I mentioned. Welfare state, welfare state services have been partly reduced, while at the same time, new construction sites, bold ones, have been started. For instance, the long-term care insurance system, and moves to support family and education investments in a new way. Some reforms have taken place, for instance, the incorporation of a demographic factor, the decision in favor of raising the age limit at which retirement starts, the partial and state-moderated privatization of old age insurance, so-called Riester-Rente, more emphasis, the support for including more women into the labor force, some labor market reforms, more emphasis on gender justice, more emphasis on basic minimum entitlements for all, and on financing from the tax fund. So the system has moved quite a way beyond the Bismarckian pattern in the last 2 decades. It was less resistant to change than many critics and political scientists have feared and deplored, and Steinkunle is one of those who has made this point recently very convincingly. But it is a painful process. Changes of this sort contradict widespread expectations, welfare mentalities, themselves a product of a successful development of recent decades. They are experienced as unfair, as losses of entitlements, and the resulting disappointment in our system can easily be translated into resistance, protest, and high political costs for those parties who shoulder the difficult and necessary task of reform. There's much talk about crisis. The system crunches. Can civil society help? So, I come to my second point. The concept civil society has experienced a renaissance in the social sciences and in the public debate since the 1980s. Historians have also worked on this topic. They did research on the history of the concepts. They traced them back into long traditions of Western political thoughts, If you do this in German, you use the word Bürger, and you play with the double meaning of Bürger between bourgeois and citoyen. And one of the promising lines of research was to discover the close relationship and contradictions between the culture of the bourgeoisie, the Bürgertum, on the one hand, and the rise of the program and partially the reality of a civil society. Historians and social scientists also dealt with the fact that the existence of a lively and rich civil society in Germany did not prevent the destruction of Weimar democracy in the late 20s and early 30s at all. Civil society proved to be helpless against the totalitarian temptation and the dictatorial takeover. Civil society cannot fill in for a failing representative democracy. Rather, it needs it in order to function. The dictatorships of the 20th century have suppressed and damaged civil society, but in opposing and resisting dictatorial rule, the idea of civil society has gained new strength. For instance, in East Central Europe, where Czech, Polish, and Hungarian dissidents have strongly contributed since the 1980s to reviving and spreading the concept and the idea of civil society again. In the Federal Republic, one finding of historians was that the imperial Germany was not just an autocratic system, but a place for a very lively civil society. And certainly for the Federal Republic of Germany, it is clear that civil society initiatives and organizations, associations, clubs, foundations, local initiatives, neighborhood networks, NGOs, social movements have increased over the recent decades. And the new form of digital communication plays its complicated role. Let me shorten this part and move to the third step and talk about the relationship between welfare state and civil society, Sozialstaat, and Bürgergesellschaft. And here there are some overlaps with the presentations we have heard already. Clearly, welfare state and civil society, as I understand them, have in common that the goals of their actors and the logics of their behavior clearly differ from those of the market and market actors. Both are non-capitalist. Both are in tension to commodification. Both relate to purposes which transcend the particularity of individuals and reach out into the public sphere, relating to common concerns in some way or another. Both the Sozialstaat and some civil society activities aim at risk control, welfare provision, and collective care for the future. Again, something they have in common. Solidarity is something which can be pursued with the means of the welfare state, but also in the framework of civil society. Still, in many discussions, civil society and the welfare state appear as structures in contrast and even opposition. The one is based on governmental regulation from above, the other on societal self-organization from below. One is obligatory, legally binding, even compulsive. The other voluntary, at the utmost contractually fixed. Welfare state activities have a certain limited tendency of becoming universal. Civil society initiatives are highly selective. Those follow general rules and usually promote some form of standardization. These are heterogeneous and offer much space for spontaneity and inequality. While there is a certain affinity, although not 100%, between civil society commitments and middle-class status, the Sozialstaat aims to reach the social layers below, the working classes, the poor. In all these respects, the welfare state and civil society stand for different principles and are in tension with each other. And this, I believe, is not without historical justification. This view is not without historical justification. Take the emergence of the insurance-oriented welfare state in Germany in the late 19th century as an example. There were, of course, many motives and forces at work, but among them the conviction was important, and I think correct, that the desired degree of protection and care for broad layers of the population, especially the industrial working class, could not, under the new conditions of industrialization and urbanization, be attained by the individuals and families alone, nor by the existing civil society initiatives like friendly societies, journeyman brotherhoods, church-based charity, or middle-class philanthropy. In other words, the rise of the welfare state as such was a response to the deficits of non-governmental forms of protection, risk-sharing, and care, including the arrangements offered by civil society. And a second point, there has been some crowding out now and then. Comparison between continental European and US American institutions of education may lead to the observation that a powerful and early development government-based system of higher education on the continent of Europe has been one of the reasons why private donations and self-organized private schools have emerged to a lesser extent here than in the US. On the other hand, a rich and differentiated system of civic initiatives, philanthropy, and community-based arrangements of care and protection help to explain the observable underdevelopment of welfare state coverage in the US. And this is, of course, what some critics of the welfare state have emphasized. The welfare state's built-in tendency of reducing, weakening, sometimes even stifling a society's capability for self-help. Along the same line runs the argument of those who, usually on the left, are skeptical vis-à-vis the vis-à-vis the defense of civil society initiatives, because they fear that such non-governmental initiatives may serve as an excuse for the erosion of the welfare state and even contribute to its dismantling. In both cases, I quote Christoph Conrad, in both cases, critiques from the right and the left follow the model of a zero-sum game argument. So, there is, however, another side, as previous speakers have already argued. There are arguments and there is evidence which illustrate and show the compatibility of the welfare state and civil society, and they even may support and reinforce each other. First, I would like to remind us that over the decades, there have been strong traditions which advocated the Sozialstaat as an arrangement for facilitating self-help. All over Europe, Catholic parties have supported decisions in favor of the welfare state. At the same time, many of their members were and are committed to the principle of subsidiarity. Similarly, strong trade unions usually supported the rise of the welfare state, at least in the German case of the 20th century, but at the same time tried to reserve collective bargaining rights and the responsibility for certain welfare measures to themselves. And of course, representatives of liberal ideas, liberal in the European sense, have justified their usually limited support for the welfare state by demanding that it should be used to empower and to activate individuals, families, groups, and circles, to practice self-help. These arguments by Catholics, social democratic trade unionists, liberals, clearly assume the compatibility of civil society's self-regulation with a welfare state, as long as this welfare state respects its own limits, leaves space to non-governmental forms of social policy, and even encourages them. Secondly, I want to point to the specific structure of the German welfare state. What emerged in the 1880s was not exactly what Bismarck had hoped to happen. If he had had his way, the German welfare state would have been much more statist, financed by taxes, with more stress on equal minimum protection for all, more centralized. But as a consequence of the limited finances of the central state, and as a consequence of the intensive bargaining between different parties in the parliament, quite a different system emerged, financially based on contributions by employers and employees, the benefits graded, and highly pluralistic in the sense that intermediary groups, for instance, professional, occupational groups and their specific insurances, were not excluded and replaced, but incorporated, including workers and employers' representatives in the running of the system, with important long-term social consequences with respect to the integration of social democracy into the system. Until today, the German welfare state is characterized by the intensive participation of intermediary groups and institutions, professional associations, semi-private insurance systems, Ersatz- und Hilfskassen, local and corporate representatives, churches, organized church groups, employers and workers' representatives. This, in the literature, is usually described as corporatist, with good reasons, and seen as part of the conservative welfare state type for which Germany allegedly stands. But I at least propose another interpretation. Clearly, the German welfare state is a non-statist, non-etatist type of welfare state, less statist than in France. And if you think of health policies, even less statist than Britain. And Peter Hannock's recent study has compared British and German developments and has also made this point. In these respects, the German system is similar to Austria, of course, and I believe to Scandinavia. And it's a welfare state which has accepted, or rather was compelled to accept, a high degree of interdependence with civil society, at least with organized civil society. Both sides, by the way, can profit from this alliance, or rather entanglement. Unions, for instance, can be strengthened, and the degree of unionization can be raised if unions are involved in administering national systems of unemployment insurance. Very shortly, a third point of evidence. It has been mentioned by previous speakers. If you compare internationally, if you rank countries with respect to the intensity of civil society commitments and with respect to the intensity of their welfare states, you find a high correlation between both rank orders. North European countries rank high, South and East European countries rank low on both sides, and there is a theoretical debate on why that should be, so I leave that out. And particularly, Christoph Conrad has given other examples for showing that civil society type volunteering participation can help to mitigate some of the problems the welfare state faces, and the other way around. No question that certain welfare state measures like pensions and others have helped and encouraged civil society activities to emerge and to continue. I come to an end with two more general thoughts. I want to say that on a more general level, civil society activities can help to create or maintain the human capital of a country, a culture of both responsibility and solidarity, the moral substance of a society, and these are resources which may be hard to measure, but are likely to nourish and to strengthen and to preserve the Sozialstaat in an indirect way. No time to elaborate on that, but beyond these very specific relations between between civil society activities and the welfare state, there is a more indirect way in which a lively and committed civil society helps to reinforce resources which in an indirect way also make the strength of a welfare state, Sozialstaat, possible. And one final thought, as our short trip through German Sozialstaat history has shown, the welfare state can serve rather illiberal purposes. An active civil society will definitely helps to keep the welfare state on the side of freedom, not only on the side of security, equality, and discipline. Our trip through different phases of German history has also shown that the Sozialstaat is dependent of many factors. It does neither create nor control. And I want to stress one of these factors is civil society. A prudent combination of Sozialstaat and Bürgergesellschaft, of welfare state and civil society, may be of strategic importance for both sides. Although, of course, the picture is complicated, and as we see from Dedas Kochbol's presentation on the United States, civil society means many things, and there are also forms of civil society which may question and problematize the welfare state. In this whole debate, I think we can learn a lot from the Nordic model, about which you have started to hear a lot. Thank you very much.